started at the CTA as president in 2015, and he might have thought that he had his dream job when he started in 2015. He had been preparing for being president of the CTA, I think, for much of his life, with positions at the CTA, where he got ever more responsibility, and several stints in Washington, also with ever more responsibility. And then in 2015, the job was open. And while many might be swayed by the sort of siren call of Washington, Dorval was ready to come home. He is truly a Chicagoan with deep roots in the city. And when he came back, he did have something of a honeymoon for a couple of years after 2015. There was no recession, no strikes. Ridership was holding steady, if not increasing. And then came the pandemic. Truly a time that tries men's souls. Where to cut, how to clean and ventilate the buses, how to keep bus drivers safe while providing service for those essential workers, the nurses, the medical professionals, the grocery store workers, who were keeping the rest of us supplied with food and medical care. But President Carter tackled the pandemic challenge with compassion and integrity. Chicagoans should be proud and grateful that he was at the helm. Although there are many accolades for Dorval Carter, and I won't even go into the many awards that he's received, but he's a civil rights champion, a prime strategist on finding more money for public transit. His board called him a rock star last December. There may be none more significant than he kept the trains and buses running during the pandemic. Dorval understands that there's a human story behind every data point. So please join me in welcoming Dorval Carter.
Thank you, Ellen, for those kind remarks. What Ellen didn't tell you is that she's been a part of my journey to all these various places over the years, and not only did we work together at CTA for a number of years, but I also convinced her to become a part of the Obama administration with me, and she also moved into many positions with greater responsibilities over time. So I think we both have had very interesting careers that we've been able to deal with. So thank you all for having me here today. And let me tell everyone good afternoon, and my God, it's good to see people and faces again. It's been way too long. The theme of this year's summit, All Together Now, Collective Action for Shared Mobility, is especially appropriate as we move towards what we all hope will soon become a largely post-COVID world. The scientific community has made clear that some variant of the virus may always exist, but their collective hope appears to be that we may see a brighter light at the end of the tunnel in the coming months. Across the growing global mobility ecosphere, there are tremendous differences in the services that various public and private transportation companies provide, the philosophies we embrace, and the issues we believe are most critical to serving the public. There are frequent and ongoing debates in our community, like the benefits of rideshare services versus public transit, or whether autonomous vehicles are safer or better for traffic and the environment than cars with drivers. I believe these kinds of conversations are necessary and help shape the transportation world we work in. We share customers who live in very different transportation worlds than our parents did, or our grandparents. Our children and grandchildren using apps on their phones to reserve scooters that will pick them up and take them to a bus or rail station, or to pick up e-bikes that will be used to go and pick up a car that they will rent from someone else, or using yet another app. These are all very new and unusual things that have developed in recent years. But for all of our differences, COVID required us all to do the same thing at the same time, which is very rare. Whether your agency or business serves the public at sea, in the air, on the roads, or on the rails, leaders at every transportation organization in the world had to ask, what do we do now? As we began to wrestle with the many significant challenges the pandemic presented, it was against the background of questions for which there were few answers, like the ones you see here, which are headlined from between February of 2020 and April of 2020. We didn't yet know exactly where the pandemic was headed, but already there were stories and discussions of an outright catastrophe in our particular industry, and talk of public transit's death knell and death spiral. The bottom line was that how every agency proceeded was different depending upon where you were, the services you provided, and customer travel behavior during this once-in-a-lifetime crisis. The onset and spread of this virus and the extraordinary public health emergency it created was a process of uncertainty, difficult choices, necessary change, and, in some cases, revelations about our industry. At CTA, while working through the extraordinary financial and operational challenges COVID presented, every adjustment we made was made with equity and racial justice front of mind. Specifically, as we learned that the virus was hitting low-income communities and majority Black and brown neighborhoods the hardest, I decided that serving the transit needs of our most vulnerable and transit-dependent customers and protecting our own frontline employees, who are also largely people of color, would be the North Star that would guide us through this pandemic. What I did not know, however, is that our response would be the first step in further strengthening our already solid commitment to transit equity. COVID-19 amplified systemic inequities directly related to our core customer base. This was illustrated by findings from a group of philanthropic stakeholders and researchers led by the Field Foundation of Illinois. In their study entitled Mapping COVID-19 Recovery, more than 20 foundations, numerous public agencies, and a few private sector entities shared data and found that the hardest hit areas in Chicago had been on the south and west sides, which are also heavily low income and or majority Black and Latino. Among their findings were these conclusions. 1, essential workers are disproportionately Black and Latino. Black and Latino residents have the farthest to travel to access pharmacies. People in these communities have disparate need for access to health care. There is an unequal distribution of grocery stores throughout the city, and perhaps most unsurprisingly, public policies set the stage for these COVID-19 disparities. Each one of those facts had implications for my staff and me, because that is a significant portion of our customer base, the very transit-dependent people trying to reach their doctors, pharmacies, and grocery stores. Over time, our own ridership analysis and that of widely reported on study from the Urban Institute showed that our greatest ridership declines were on the city's north side, along the lakefront corridor, and in the central business district, all areas where average incomes generally range from solidly middle class to affluent. This part of our customer base was comprised of people who could stay home from work or had the resources necessary to consistently choose other, more expensive modes of transportation to get around the city and elsewhere. We found far less profound decreases in ridership on the city's south and west sides, especially along our busiest bus routes. It was clear that these routes run through neighborhoods where essential workers, as well as individuals and families needing to take essential, affordable bus and rail trips, lived and worked. As the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and the Chicago Department of Public Health continued to provide guidance, stressing the importance of social distancing, I realized that while it was extraordinarily difficult to get someone to wear a mask or stay at home if they did not want to, I could provide people with more space aboard our vehicles than they would be otherwise able to achieve by riding our buses. I was also able to provide more bus frequency, which meant more bus real estate throughout the day and less crowded buses. We also imposed capacity limits aboard both our 40-foot and 60-foot buses. This was a key adjustment that reduced the number of people aboard individual buses. During the worst of the pandemic, we allowed only 15 riders per 40-foot bus and 22 per 60-foot bus, which is about 30% capacity for each. which is the top line of the graphic you see here. By moving some buses from routes that were being underutilized and moving them to busier routes, most notably on the south side, we serve the same total number of people without any service reductions. Armed with this information, I made the decision that would inform our operations throughout the balance of the pandemic. Despite our lower ridership numbers, not only would we not reduce any of our normally scheduled bus and rail service, but we would also expand bus frequency along our busiest corridors. Adoption of this principle allowed us to operationalize what I would call racial equity, which is helping to accommodate our most transit-dependent customers' needs in a COVID-impacted environment, especially our overwhelmingly African-American customers. As my management team and I discussed this and other policy changes that we would implement over the following weeks and months, one thing became clearly obvious to me. Every decision we would make would first be informed by our humanity, focusing on equity and with particular care for low-income and large transit-dependent communities. It was this clear, direct difference that shone a light on equity's impact in public transportation. It would typically be very difficult, if not impossible, to get such specific and exact data on what would happen if people were asked whether or not they would choose public transit or not under unusual or extraordinary circumstances. This dependence on transit from this core group of riders would normally be masked by our broader ridership data. In the clear light of day, however, as customers have continued a slow but steady return to transit and people are generally becoming more comfortable with being in public, I have been very thankful for the compliments that some people have extended to me for keeping as much service running as possible during the pandemic. But I want to be clear, and I haven't really discussed this much with anyone publicly. That was not always the case. In public and private forums, many people took me to task for running too much service. They called it wasteful, a mistake, and said that I was being inefficient. I, of course, disagreed then, and I still do today, for two very distinct reasons. First, transit-dependent riders need our services during the pandemic as much as ever. For this group of people, the pandemic was an additional uncertainty, adding to existing challenges, like a lack of financial resources. I believed then, and I believe now, that we owed them the best service we could provide, and that CTA service had to be something that they could rely on. Second, it was important to me to keep our employees and customers safe by providing as much service as possible at a time when the ability to practice social distancing was paramount. We worked hard to separate our workers from our customers and to ensure our riders could put as much space between themselves and other customers as possible. To be clear, I was encouraged by members of the business community and others in the private sector, both here in Chicago and beyond the borders of our city, to run 4-car train concepts instead of 8 cars and to reduce rail and bus service. Many of my national peers did exactly that, but I refused. Had I acted on those suggestions, it may have even saved us some money, but it would not have been equitable. I knew and understood that there was a risk involved in my decisions, and I will discuss that a little bit more in a moment. But to follow their advice would have been a disservice to the very customers who had to use public transportation when others chose not to. In my opinion, the decision to never reduce service during the pandemic was a direct reflection of CTA's core values and my commitment to serving those who need us the most. My senior leadership team has helped me to groom a management staff that shares in our belief in equity, and quite frankly, we flatly refused to place saving money or even operational efficiency in front of the health and safety of our riders. I think the pandemic made clear to all of us how vital federal funding is to ensure public transit success, especially when inordinate stressors are placed on our system, that result in extraordinarily decrease in ridership and revenue. For our part, the decisions I made to require faith in the federal government that, when push came to shove, if we demonstrated that our services were critical, legislatures would ultimately believe the funding to support our operations was necessary. Thankfully, that faith was, in this case, well placed. And I know that's saying a lot for Washington, D.C. We, in our particular case, have been allocated over $2.2 billion in federal relief funds. And I need to take a moment here to offer my thanks to the entire federal Illinois delegation for their support in getting us the money that desperately kept the buses and trains running when I was making those decisions to keep running full service. In addition, late last year, CTA was also provided significant funding under President Biden's $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill that will provide additional funding for our capital needs. As part of that bill, CTA has also gotten the opportunity to pursue funding that will accelerate our all-station accessibility program, what we refer to as ASAP, via a dedicated funding stream, which will make our system 100% accessible to people with disabilities. I'm also very thankful to Senator Tammy Duckworth, who worked closely with us for her leadership on making this particular new program a reality. ASAP, in my opinion, is a broader expression of equity, expanding access to transit to a larger number of people, and I am very excited to know that for the first time in the history of the Transportation Funding Program, there will be a dedicated funding stream available to support those needs. I also want to highlight another way in which federal dollars are benefiting our customers. We are currently engaged in our Red Line Extension Project, or what we refer to as RLE, which will extend the Red Line on Chicago's far south side by 30 blocks into what is mostly a poor and minority community. Without question, I consider it probably the most important project that I will work on as my time as president. We are now completing key milestones to advance RLE in the approval process for a competitive federal New Starts grant, which would provide a historic level of funding, more than $1 billion, to construct the project. Why is this project necessary? This project is necessary because the inequitable decisions to stop Red Line service before reaching the southern border of this city that was made decades ago is the only part of the city where rail service does not continue to the city's edge or beyond. I personally am a product of the South Side, and for years, residents of the far South Side communities have long called for an extension of the Red Line. Unfortunately, the project was delayed for years for numerous reasons that I can't even go into right now. However, since 2011, the project has made more progress than it had in several decades previous, and we are currently moving through the extensive federal New Starts program. A big part of our ability to move forward on this program, or on this project, has been the overwhelming community support that we have received from people like this.
I work with low-income individuals and families, so many of them do not have cars. The Red Line extension is going to be a major plus for our far South Side community. It's something that we've needed for a very long time.
The Red Line extension would bring new opportunities to the people in the area.
So I see nothing but goodness coming out of this whole development. So we have to stay vocal and we have to be engaged.
So as part of the overall funding strategy for the RLE project, in 2016, we worked closely with our former mayor and local state leadership to win the authority to create a transit TIF increment financing, or TIF district, which could provide a portion of the project's local match requirements under the New Starts program. National case studies of other FTA-funded projects showed that TIF has been used across the U.S. to provide a portion of the project's local match requirement, including here in Chicago. At this time, we are pursuing the creation of a transit TIF, which will be the first of its kind alternative local funding source, with the ability to unlock the federal funding and make this project a reality. Moreover, our pursuits of this TIF was its own expression of equity, because if we are successful, it will allow us to serve an otherwise disenfranchised portion of our customer base. To ensure that we are in position to take advantage of these potential funding commitments, in 2009, I directed our staff to budget $310 million for the preliminary engineering design work for RLE, which the community rightfully saw as a statement of commitment to getting this project done. We are also constantly engaging the community on important issues, from gathering residents' input on the alignment of the track to working with local leaders to help disseminate project information into the neighborhoods. We're continuing to move forward with the project, and I'm excited because I look forward to finally undoing this gross inequity. So before I wrap up, I'd like to leave you with this. My experience at CTA, not only since I've been in the president's chair, but throughout my many years rising through the ranks, has been that unless you have buy-in from senior leadership, bureau chiefs, and department heads, even the best policies are nearly impossible to implement successfully. Equity can be an even more challenging adjustment because leadership teams that have not been concerned with these issues must learn to make them a part of their front-end thinking regarding policy, capital investments, and operations. That may not sound like much, but decisions that are made without any equity considerations have consequences, from the political to the reputational to the financial. Worse, they inevitably shortchange and delay progress for minority and low-income communities because too often we know that the greatest reputational returns on investment and the greatest political rewards come from first serving the affluent. You change that thinking by demanding that change of yourself. First, then advising staff that equity is not something we relegate to a secondary consideration, but that we begin every consideration with a look at whom we are serving, why, and most importantly, whether it is fundamentally fair. No matter where you work, whether it is in the private or public sector, please understand this one thing. Your budgets tell the world whom and what you care about. Your policies do the same thing, as does the culture of your organization. In search of building more equitable transportation organizations, we must ensure that all three of those things are aligned and aimed squarely at ensuring that you are serving those who are normally forgotten. Only then can we ensure that inequities of the past are undone and that a new industry-wide pursuit of better equity outcomes can be embraced. It is a challenge, not only for organizational leaders, but for all of us. Thank you. Okay, I hear I got time for one question. Man, I timed that out just right. Nobody has a question? Right over here. Yes, sir.
Somewhat common knowledge that the federal support. Oh. Hello, I'm W. Robert Schultz III. I'm from Chicago. Been here for 30 years. Moved here primarily because I didn't want to drive for the rest of my life. So my question is, I think it's common knowledge that the federal support that we've seen, and it's been quite generous and beneficial, is not going to last forever. What do you see CTA and other transit agencies doing to prepare for that eventuality?
That's a very good question. Yeah, we estimate that the money that we receive from the federal government will last us through 2025. And at that point in time, we're going to hit a cliff. I think that before the pandemic hit, we were already beginning as an industry to go through a period of transformation where innovation and flexibility was going to be key to continue to grow ridership. Now we're having a conversation about how to get ridership back, which makes that effort even more on point than ever before. As we're watching the ridership growth right now, we're seeing a regular and continuing climb of increased ridership. But even today, I am only at about 50% of what my ridership was before the pandemic hit. What we don't know yet is where the ceiling is on what the ridership is going to be like. What we do know is that businesses are probably not going to have their employees coming back to their downtown offices 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, like they used to. And what that means is that as a system, we have to start adjusting both our thinking about what our customer travel patterns are going to be and what type of fare options we're going to have to offer in order to support the travel needs of our customers, which may be very different than what we were used to doing in the past. That inevitably also leads to the bigger question about funding. And one of the things that we will be having a conversation about is whether the funding for the region needs to reflect the reality of what our services are that are being provided today. And how can that funding be adjusted to deal with the realities of what we need to do in the future? Fundamental to that point is obviously ensuring that no matter what we face in terms of overall ridership, that the funding is available to provide the services to those communities and to those individuals who are transit dependent and rely on public transportation as the sole focus for their mobility needs. That was why I made the point that our funding decisions are equity decisions. Historically, when CTA and other transit systems have had to make funding decisions, it has been in a negative environment of budget cuts. And historically, the services that get cut first tend to be those that are most dependent for those who have very few transit options. That's a cycle that we cannot continue moving forward. And if there's anything that I felt came out of the pandemic, was a reflection and an understanding of how critical those services are to that group of people, and more importantly, how critical that group of people are to the overall economy that we all rely on. I am hopeful, optimistic, some people may say a little bit foolish, that I'll be able to use that as ammunition to ensure that we get the level of funding we need to provide the services that we're going to have to do in the future, regardless of where we ultimately end up with ridership. Time will tell if I'm right or not, but stay tuned.
Thank you.